Hi everyone, and welcome to the Boost Productivity and Profitability with a Soil Carbon Project webinar this evening. Thank you to everyone who's jumped on so far. I think we've got a few more popping on, but we might get started in the interest of time. So firstly, I'd like to introduce our speakers this evening, including myself. So I'm the Advisory Manager at CarbonLink and helping farmers with their carbon farming practices to improve their land and health for productivity. I have a Bachelor of Animal Science and a Bachelor of Agriculture through Charles Sturt, and was an agronomist for 7 years before joining CarbonLink in 2022, and really enjoy the focus on practical approach, science-backed methods and supporting sustainable land management, as well as being passionate and dedicated to the carbon farming work for farmers, offering a clear guidance and solutions that benefit both the land and their livelihoods. We've got Terry McCosker here as well, and he's known as to be one of the great innovators of the Australian agricultural industry. He's committed to bridging and finding solutions for the divisions between traditional and regenerative agriculture, as well as ensuring the resilience of farming families. With over 55 years in research, extension and property management across public and private sectors, Terry has published over 40 papers. And so in recognition of his contributions, Central Queensland University awarded him an Honorary Doctor of Agribusiness in March 2015. And he was achieved an OAM in 2021 on the Queen's Birthday Honours for service to agriculture. Terry is a Churchill Fellow and a Fellow of the Tropical Grasslands Society, and has chaired the Australian Beef Expo, serving on numerous advisory committees. And he's co-founded RCS in 1985, establishing a benchmark for capacity building in rural and regional Australia, and independently rated by a government survey as Australia's most trusted farming knowledge source. A pioneer in soil carbon and carbon farming, Terry founded CarbonLink in 2007, where he remains the chairman. Today, CarbonLink is Australia's largest soil carbon project developer and is managing over 250,000 hectares and having a successful project management on 92% of the soil carbon credits issued to date. We also have Rob Crossley. He's has an extensive background in soil science. He's our Chief Scientist Officer, who has completed a Master of Agricultural Science from the University of Queensland. His diverse career includes roles in research, government consulting, and the private sector, focusing on soil science, spatial data systems, and analytics. With nearly 30 years of experience working with GIS and integrating various technologies, Robert has developed practical solutions for agriculture, environmental management, and natural resource applications. In 2020, Robert joined CarbonLink as Chief Scientific Officer, bringing his passion for soil science back to the forefront. He recognises the importance of soil carbon for boosting agricultural productivity, profitability, and environmental benefits like improved water quality and carbon sequestration. Robert's expertise in data analytics, spatial database applications, and digital agriculture supports CarbonLink's mission. He works closely with the team to build advanced systems and promote the sustainable agriculture and ensure long-term resilience and environmental stewardship. So thank you both Terry and Rob for coming tonight to present this webinar. So we've touched on it briefly in those introductions, but CarbonLink has been involved in the industry for the past 17 years. We're involved in all aspects of the soil carbon method, from our R&D team, GIS specialists, advisory and project management teams, as well as working with and supporting our clients on these 25 to 100-year project commitments. And we're currently partnered with 56 projects covering almost 260,000 hectares across Australia. So a little bit of context for the soil carbon method into the bigger space of the Australian carbon market, which is obviously the key mechanism for us to meet the Australian targets for 2030 and 2050. The ACCU scheme, Emissions Reduction Fund and Safeguard Mechanism all contribute to the legislation and the development of methods. And so the soil carbon method has proven to be a rigorous method for measurement of soil carbon, with several projects now succeeding past their first reporting period and proving to be substantial credit earners or Australian carbon credit units issuances that we've seen in 2023 and 2024 to assist with the enterprise profitability. So next we'll show you just a little short video to introduce one of our producers from their perspective, their experience so far. Sorry guys, we've just noted that the sound's not working on that video. We'll just see if we can quickly fix that in the background. While that's getting fixed, this is Tom Archer. He registered a project with us in 2016, and he's also successfully been issued carbon credits from resampling in 2021. And Terry, do you want to jump in and say a little bit more about Tom? You're on mute, Terry.
There's a lot of melon country on Tom's place, and a lot of this, some of the grass you can see there's actually Mitchell grass, and probably 15 years ago there was virtually no sign of Mitchell grass. Hasn't been seen in this area for probably 60, 70 years, if at all. And now it's coming right back in and right through the top of the melon holes. The melon holes much more productive than they used to be. It was interesting that we're actually able to do a carbon project across the melon holes on this sort of country as well. But I think we'll just skip past this and keep going with the presentation. Thanks, Cassie.
No, sorry about that, everyone. So the purpose of this evening's webinar is to debunk the misconceived perception that undertaking a soil carbon project requires a reduction to productivity or profitability. We want to acknowledge that this is a real barrier to entry for many producers and show how the data behind our projects support the opportunities of getting involved in this exciting and evolving space. So I'll hand to Terry now to speak further on this.
I think that there's a fair bit of thought in the industry that to do a carbon project with animals, for example, that you've actually got to destock, and it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, you wouldn't be allowed to do a soil carbon project if you destocked or didn't do agriculture on that land. So it's actually the opposite to what a lot of people expect. And I think that the way I look at these carbon projects is that they should be a bonus for doing the right thing for your land management in the first place. So if we've got our grazing right, or we're managing our cropping systems in the right way or in a better way to build soil health within those systems, we're going to be increasing productivity, which in livestock is carrying capacity, and in cropping is generally lowering inputs. And in parts of Australia, even in the grazing industry, it means lowering inputs as well. Generally across over the last 35, 40 years that I've been working in the grazing space, we've found that we get in Northern Australia, we can get up to about a 50%, 50 to 100% increase in carrying capacity within a 3 to 5 year period. And also in the southern states, as we move into I've got some feedback going on here. As we move into the southern states, what happens is the carrying capacity doesn't necessarily increase, but the number of inputs come out and the profitability improves. So generally, what I would say is let's get the land functioning in the way it wants to function, and then your carbon credits or a carbon project is going to be a bonus that comes out of that. So next slide, thanks, Cassie. So one of the things that we've got in Australia that's quite rare compared to other countries is that we have the legislation that allows farmers to sell carbon from either soils or off trees. We have the regulation that regulates that so that there's confidence in the market. We have methodologies, which are the recipes basically that describe how we're going to create credits. And then we have a market. And the market in Australia is built around the safeguard mechanism, where the largest emitters in Australia have to either reduce their emissions or offset them. And those of you who are following the carbon market will know that in the last 2 to 3 months, it's actually gone up nearly 30%. And it's on a steady decline. And last week, the spot price was $42 a tonne. So there's some forecasts, there's plenty of forecasts around. They're all different. None of them are right, obviously, but there's forecasts that we'll be at $100 by 2030, and you can see some on the screen as well. So who knows where it'll be? We don't tend to budget those high prices looking forward. If you're getting a price of $40 to $50 a tonne for CO2 going forward, you're going to be making a lot of money out of it from a land management perspective. The next one, thanks, Cassie. So there's quite a lot of barriers here, and I think these are probably things that you come across, every day. Do you want to kick off on what you see as some of the barriers and to people taking up projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So discussing project opportunities with clients is something we do every day on the road, and there's often common themes to those barriers. And as it is a relatively new space compared to most farming practices, which obviously have evolved over decades, it's fair to say that there are these perceived barriers to potential impact a soil carbon project might have on the productivity and profitability of an enterprise. And so there's a couple on the screen there, but could you please explain a bit on your experience, firstly on how the flexibility of a project influences practice change, but then also how the unknown of future property sale or succession might play out, and if these barriers are real, and if you could sort of touch on those in a bit more detail, please.
Okay, so firstly, there is some additional administration. So while there's a fair bit of money to make out of carbon credits, you don't get it for nothing. And one of the things that you've got to put in is some effort to keep records, principally. CarbonLink does the hard slog. You just have to manage your property in the way that is agreed with yourself and the regulator and ourselves, that are going to, in a way that's going to sequester carbon. So it doesn't specifically add complexity, but it does mean that there's generally a practice change that's going to sequester carbon. And there could be 3 or 4 that gives you the opportunity to do several different things at once. Over time, that practice change can be reviewed. So if you want to do something different and make some changes, all that's doable within the method. There's a number of probably uncertainties or concerns that people have, and one of them is destocking, for example, in a drought. That doesn't have a negative impact on a project. So all that basically does is lower your emissions for the period that we're in the drought. So it doesn't have a negative impact. In fact, one of the things that's very useful about having carbon credits in the bank is that when you do hit a drought or a market depression, for example, you actually have credits that you can pull out of the bank and keep your cash flow up where you want it. So if you've got kids, go to boarding schools and bank interest to pay and those sort of things, then there is actually a backup plan for the rural business, which is pretty useful. I don't think we have been through with the projects that we're running. We've been through the worst drought in 100 years. We've been through 2 floods. We've been through the 2019 bushfires where one property was completely burnt out. We've been through pasture dieback on up to 30 to 40% of the properties. And given all of those things, they still sequestered carbon in the soil and significantly measurable changes. So while we do run into these things, so far they don't appear to have been the barrier that you might expect. There's a few more barriers that we probably need to look at, and these are things like the concerns that people have. We'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Cassie. The concerns that people have, things like what happens if I reverse the carbon, if it goes backwards. That is quite possible that can happen. If it goes backwards between samples, let's say it was between your first sample and your next one, like in other words, your baseline and your first crediting period, and it goes backwards, nothing actually happens. You haven't got any credits, no cost in that, and you can just keep going, let it roll for a few more years, and then we can check again to see whether you've sequestered carbon. If you've actually sequestered carbon, you've sold credits and you have a reversal, then again, you just wait a few more years, rebuild that back again, and away you go. If you got into a project and you found that you actually hadn't sequestered any carbon at all after we've measured it for the first time, then you have no obligation to anyone at that point. If you want to, you've got 2 choices. You can cancel the project and say, well, it wasn't going to work here, or you can give it another go and try and figure out why it didn't work and what was the problem. Was there a soil issue? Was there something that wasn't picked up in terms of chemistry, physics? Was it rainfall? Was it management? What was it that actually meant it didn't sequester? And we'll go back and try and sort that out. A lot of people are also concerned about the legislation and the government changing. The legislation behind carbon projects is bipartisan. So it's unlikely to change. The thing that can change is the regulations and the rules, and they do change, and it's really our job as CarbonLink to keep up with those regulations. Our staff have meetings with the regulator basically once a fortnight, and we have a very good relationship and are able to solve problems by working with them on the way through it. But there will be shifts over time. Normally, whatever you're doing now, if there's a shift in methodology, whatever you're doing now will roll straight into whatever comes down the track. So it's not likely that you're actually going to lose a project because there's a change in regulations. There are some intricacies and complexities in measurement. Those are things that we take care of. It's why we've got a quarter of our staff have got PhDs, because there is a lot of complexity in what we do, as Rob, as our chief scientist, can attest to. I think one of the biggest risks that I've seen, and there's a number of people attempting it to do their own projects. The methodology is about 300 pages long, and there's 40 or 50 pages of equations. But probably from our experience in getting projects right through to credits, the biggest risk that you would run doing it on your own is failing an audit and not being able to support that audit process, which is very complex and very involved. And if you fail an audit, then your project fails and there's no credits. And I know that there are people out there attempting that, but we're already starting to get projects come from other developers and other people to us because the people that own those projects are a bit concerned about getting credits into the future. So that's probably one of the biggest risks that I've seen. So if we move on from that,
Terry, just before you move on, sorry, there's just a question that's come through the chat, talking about the transition and the costs and barriers associated there. Could you speak a little bit more to how we're seeing people transition from a conventional to more regenerative practices and what's involved?
Great question. So to do a carbon project, there has to be a practice change. And that practice change generally in agriculture is going to increase productivity or reduce costs. So if we take a grazing business where, you know, I've got 30 or 40 years experience, it's going to cost you somewhere between $50, maybe $120 a hectare to upgrade water systems and upgrade fencing and put in more fencing to be able to rotate with a reasonable intensity. That in itself over time in our data set has generally returned about a 30 to 35% annualised return on capital just on the investment into water and wire in a grazing business. And that's in increased carrying capacity generally, but you can also sometimes get increased productivity, but it's mostly increased carrying capacity or reduced costs. That's your first, and that's probably your biggest cost. Well, it is your biggest cost. Your second cost then is baselining. So if we took a sort of a, let's say we took a 2,000 or 3,000 hectare property, baselining cost on that might be somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. Now, for a lot of producers, they might have the funds or be able to borrow the money to go and do the development or the practice change because it's going to improve your productivity in the long run and in the short run as well. You may not have the money to do the baselining. In that case, we've actually got a deal with an emitter, and they will provide funds up front to pay for the baselining, and then that is repaid to them out of the first round of carbon credits. So we take a higher percentage at that first round, and then that pays for that upfront cost. And from then on, you're pretty well in the income earning stage. So there's not much need for funding from then on. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Terry.
Okay. All right. So opportunities, there are opportunities, and I think that the opportunities are really in production to start with, and that's where we should be focused. Let's look at whatever it takes to get our productivity up, and that's easily done through grazing systems. They're not rocket science, and lowering our inputs. One of the things we have seen from the addition of legumes, particularly through Queensland, is that you can get often around a 20% increase in growth rate of animals when you add legumes into grassland. So there's productivity opportunities quite apart from the carbon project itself, and we really need to be looking at, as I've already mentioned, that a carbon project is a bonus on what you should be doing to increase productivity in the first place. So if we move on from there, did you have anything else to add into that one, Em?
No, that's great. Thanks.
Rightio. So move on to the next slide. Sorry, go back one. So one of the things we found is that our current clients have carbon negative livestock production. Now, while that's not worth anything at the moment, carbon neutral and carbon negative is not really worth anything in the market, but it is something you can guide about. The other thing that's interesting is there's a narrative around cattle, for example, that they're bad for the environment and they should be banned, and because they're emitters and all this sort of stuff. What we've actually found is that livestock have sequestered between 11 and 23 tonnes of carbon dioxide into soils for every tonne of livestock carried over a 5-year period after accounting for emissions. So it's not you know, it's absolutely the complete opposite to the narrative that's in the media, and that livestock are in fact, if managed properly, managed correctly, will sequester a lot of carbon. And in a soil carbon, in a grazing project, we cannot sequester carbon without using the livestock to sequester it. One of the other things that's come out of this is the increase in water holding capacity. Basically, for every tonne of organic carbon that you add to your soils, you'll be adding somewhere between 4 and 10 tonnes of water. On one of these properties where they sequestered around, I think from memory, 32,000 tonnes of organic carbon into their soil. That translates into an additional 200,000 tonnes of water holding capacity on 2,500 hectares. Now, I think what that does is when you've got that additional water holding capacity, and every 5 years we can be adding that level of water holding capacity, what that's doing is you're going to be last into drought and first out when you've increased your water holding capacity by, you know, that degree. So there's a lot of co-benefits from adding carbon to soil. And one of them is resilience against environmental stress. And it's due to the biology. As we build carbon in the soil, in fact, it's a symbiotic relationship. We can't build the carbon without the biology, and we can't build the biology without the carbon. So those two things build together. But particularly the mycorrhizal fungi, they have a significant impact on environmental stress, on and water holding capacity, because they're actually the guys that sequester the carbon in the first place. So building that microbial population is absolutely important. Did you have anything to comment on biology, Rob? No, you're frozen,
I think, yeah. I think biology is something that's been known about in soil science for a very long time, but largely ignored. Like none of the modelling that people use to make conclusions about what's happening with soil carbon actually includes the biology. And I think we're going to see dramatic increases in scientific understanding of what's going on. We don't even have a good measurement to be able to say what's happening. So, you know, there's some steps to go. But, you know, since working with CarbonLink and just listening to the stories, you know, I just recognise it's an area that there is so much to learn and understand about these systems. But, you know, I've got a textbook from 1983 that I couldn't afford back then, and I'm reading it, and there's 2 chapters on the sort of stuff we're talking about. So that's, you know, almost 50 years ago. So, or 40 years ago. And I think we're only just beginning to understand the changes and understand how to make those changes and the importance and what that implies to building soil carbon.
Thanks, Rob. And I think if anyone in the audience really wants to see how fascinating this stuff is, Google rhizophagy. And there's some videos and some talks basically in YouTube, mostly with a bloke called Dr. Robert White. And look at how a plant actually feeds, and it is absolutely mind-boggling. And rhizophagy was only discovered in Brisbane by a PhD student only about 18 or 19 years ago. So that's it, rhizophagy. Google that. All right, so let's move on. So what we could move into is some case studies, and these are long-term, people that I've been working with for a long term. So this one's in central Queensland, but west of Rocky. That is their cattle in the picture there, their country at the top. Their carrying capacity has increased from 17 SDHs per 100 mils to 34. That's doubling. So stock days per hectare per 100 mil is a measure of water use efficiency, but it's also a measure of both stocking rate and carrying capacity. And so what that's saying is that relative to rainfall, carrying capacity on that property has doubled. Water holding capacity increased by 240,000 tonnes over a 5-year period. The photographs down the bottom left-hand corner is their property on the left and the neighbouring property on the right, where we were doing some work on runoff and turbidity in the runoff. Their ground cover's in the 90th percentile and remains there regardless of season. They have carbon negative beef production, and they drew down 26 tonnes of CO2 for every tonne of livestock they carried on that property over a 5-year period after accounting for emissions. And so you can see the good that those animals are doing there. We'll move on to the next one. The next case study. So they're rolling rainfall, and one of the criticisms that we've had is that you had a lot of rainfall and therefore you sequestered a lot of carbon. The two lines on the left and then the one in the middle is where we measured we did a baseline and measured again. And you will see for that property that it's a downward trend in rainfall throughout that period. And that's a running total of rainfall. And you'll see that we actually sampled at pretty close to the lowest running total of rainfall, almost on record. So move on to the next one. This one's in the North Burnett in Queensland. Again, those photos of graphs are taken on their property. Carrying capacity is increased in it. It's very similar, so 17 SDHs. Some of their better country now is sitting up at about 55 stock days per hectare per 100 mils, and it would have started at probably about 2021, and it's more than doubled. Water holding capacity on this place has gone up by over 300,000 tonnes. Their paddock numbers have increased significantly from 30 to 60. A lot more water points, as you can see, and the distance that animals are walking to feed is down to 500 metres now. And that's one of the things that most of these guys have been doing, and the further they get into it, the more fencing they do and the more water points they put in. They've got, again, carbon negative beef. They've sequestered 13 tonnes of carbon dioxide for every tonne of beef carried over that 5-year period. So, yeah, we'll look at their rainfall now. And again, you'll see their rainfall lowered. So the carbon on these properties was sequestered basically in 2018 into 2019, and it was remeasured. We remeasured in 2021. So you can see again that we weren't quite at the lowest point of running rainfall there, and the rainfall took off after that into 2022. So we'll move on to the next property. This one's near Gundawindi. Carrying capacity here's nearly gone up threefold. So it's gone from 8 stock days per hectare to 20. So when they get to 24, it'll be a threefold increase in carrying capacity. Water increased by 200,000 tonnes. This is the one I mentioned earlier. Again, carbon negative beef. And they've drawn down 23 tonnes of CO2 for every tonne of livestock carried over that 5 years. So we'll have a look at their rainfall as well. While you're there, sorry, just go back. I'll just point out the melon-hole country there to go back there. Property C photos. There we go. Bottom left-hand corner. You'll see that sort of bare country, the white patches through that. That's the melon holes. That's the way it all looked in the beginning. And then on the right-hand side, that's the same country now, completely grassed up. And that's grazing management that's done that. But as a result of doing that, we're also sequestering carbon. So if we look at their rainfall, you'll see that it's exactly the right one. Yep. So rainfall here, you can see got very, very low in the middle, started to come back. So when we sampled, there had been good rainfall. for a couple of months at that point. So things were starting to come back after the drought. This property was probably more affected by the drought than any of the others, because you can see the massive dip and how long it was in the middle. But still sequestered good amounts of carbon. And the last one's on trap rock country down in northern New South Wales. Carry capacity here is again doubled, gone from about 30 stock days per hectare, 100 mils up to around 60. It's a smaller place, only 500 hectares in the CEA. So obviously the increase in water is less, carbon negative again. And even on that scale has drawn down 11 tonnes of CO2 for each tonne of livestock carried with click on. So again, similar trend to the last one, a very, very big dip in the middle in rainfall. And this is rolling rainfall, but it had started to rain again, so it had a little bit of rain by the time we sampled again. All right, so you can see that, if we had sampled at the beginning there and then sampled in the middle of that worst drought there, we might have found that carbon had either been held or had only gone up a little bit. What I suspect we would have found, based on some of the other properties, is that if we measured it right in that big dip in rainfall, we probably would have found a small increase in carbon from what happened back in 2017, mainly with that rainfall there. So moving on.
And so, Terry, these projects, obviously, there's been ACCU issuances, but can you talk to the challenges that were faced sort of during the measurement and results component of these projects, and whether there was any projects that weren't as successful as others?
The four that we presented were successful, and you might have noticed they started at B. So we've got one property. We did 5 properties back in 2016. And one of those yet we haven't been issued with credits. There was some issues with our measurements there, and we'll be going back and doing them again. And we're pretty certain we'll find credits there the next time round. So because they didn't have credits in the first round, nothing actually happened. So what we do is we wait, sort out any issues that we had. And there were some issues that we got wrong when we went back and sampled it. We'll get that right the next time round, and then I'm pretty certain we'll find credits there. As I mentioned earlier, well, the drought's clear here. Pasture dieback on 3 of these properties was very severe for most of the way through that 5-year period. As I mentioned, we'd had a couple of floods on one of those on property B. So there was some lot of technical stuff for Rob to sort out on this. He had a massive job for about 2 years to get credits out of these projects, because they were measured on what I'd call the 1950s, or almost a Captain Cook way of measuring soil carbon, which is what we were forced to do back in 2016. By 2021, we'd had a method that allowed us to use new technologies and new approaches to measuring. But with the different measuring techniques all the way through it, going from Captain Cook to sort of a space vehicle with the way they're operating now, there was a lot of work for Rob and the regulators to do to make that work. But it did, and the regulators and the auditors were very happy with the results, and believe me, they've been gone through with a fine-tooth comb.
And so those projects were able to capture the improvements of the methods as they progressed from the Clean Energy Regulator?
Yeah, so they started with the 2014 method. We remeasured it under the 2018 method, and they were credited under the 2021 method, which just shows that, as these things change, the projects just roll through them. The hard bit is what we have to do. But as we move forward now, everything we baseline now is using current technology. There will be new technologies come along in the future Some of those we know about now, some we don't. But as those technologies come along, costs will either come down or accuracy will improve. So just across the 4 properties that we've got credits, but you'll see the total drawdown of CO2 was 500,000 tonnes of CO2. That's after accounting for the variability and the statistics. So that's actually a statistically sound number. The ACCUs issued were only 258,000. So just over half the total drawdown is actually creditable in your first round. One of the reasons for that is that there's 25% of what you sequester that you can't sell in the first round, but if you've sequestered from the second round and further on, then you get that back. You get to add it to your next round of credits. So there's credits to come back for these guys. But again, the thing I'd point out is if you look at the 5-year project emissions at 28,000 tonnes of emissions over the 4 properties there from B through to E, then compared to the total drawdown of CO2, emissions were about 6% of total carbon drawn down, which means what you hear in the media is emissions, emissions, emissions. The reality here is that sequestration is what's going to do the job, and emissions pale into insignificance. So move on.
And so, Terry, sorry, there's just another question in the chat. So when we're talking about these pioneer projects and the journey that they went on and being the first in the industry to have this large issuance, it obviously took a bit of time to get those credits and therefore the opportunity to sell them. So what does that look like now with the new method and the timing of issuances going forward?
Good question. So with these projects, it took 2 years to work it out because of the complexity where we went through 3 methods, and no major soil carbon project had ever been credited in Australia. So the regulator was on tenterhooks, we were on tenterhooks, and we had to make sure it was correct. So it went through several internal audits, it went through several external audits, and so that all created delays. Now, our systems are better. The auditors, some auditors have now been trained, which was also a problem because auditors didn't know what they were doing either, and the regulators trained. So I think going forward, I would expect issuance to occur within 6 months of us completing a round. So it takes time to do the lab work, to do the analysis work, to check it all, to make sure that it adds up and that it passes the sniff test. Also, to prepare the information for the auditor is a major job. And then the auditors take time. The auditors might take 3 months. And then once they've passed it, there's an offsets report goes to the regulator. Then the regulator takes 3 months before they'll issue the credit. So you've got a minimum of 6 months before you're likely to get any credits after we do measurements. And that's not all our fault.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And there's just one other question in regards to these projects. Do we know how much they reduced their stocking rate during those harder conditions in the first reporting period?
Yep. So property E on the map went back to 0. Property D on the map went from carrying capacity of probably somewhere around 2,000 back to 80. C probably only cut back by about 20%, and B had cut back by probably close to 90%, between 80 and 90%. And one of the reasons for that was the amount of dieback that he had as well. He just, even when he did get rain, he got no production. So they were significant destocks.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's all from the questions at the moment.
Good. I might hand over to Rob here. One of the really significant things with doing a soil carbon project is the need for accuracy. And if I can just put this in context before I hand over to Rob, a hectare of soil down to a metre might weigh 12,000 to 15,000 tonnes. That's 1 hectare of soil. In that hectare of soil, in that 15,000 tonnes of soil, there might be somewhere between 40 and 70 tonnes of organic carbon. So firstly, we've got to be able to identify 40 to 70 tonnes of organic carbon in a 15,000 tonne pool. And then you go away and sequester carbon and you add maybe 5 tonnes, 6 tonnes, 10 tonnes before we come back and remeasure it. So now we've got to find somewhere between 5 and 10 tonnes change in carbon within a 12 to 15,000 tonne pool of soil. Not an easy task. So you need people of Rob's genius to be able to work out how to do this. And Rob's going to explain a little bit about the accuracy that we've been able to achieve.
Yeah, thanks for that, Terry. You set me the task of describing the science and mathematics behind measuring changes in soil carbon in a couple of minutes. So thanks for that, mate.
Yeah, you're right.
So yeah, when we say that a project gets credits, what does that mean? Credits are awarded based on a measured change in soil carbon over the course of the project. These measurements are done with no more than 5 years between the sampling. And the sampling generally consists of taking perhaps hundreds of soil cores on a project and analysing the extracted material for soil carbon. And from that, we work out the mean value of soil carbon across that project at that time. It'd be great if every core we measured had exactly the same amount of carbon, but they don't. So you have to quantify how much spread those results have using statistics. And since joining CarbonLink, I've had a massive lesson in statistics from all our postdocs in the group. It's been great. But these statistics represent how confident we are that we'd get a similar value if we went out and measured again using different locations for the mean value of soil carbon for that landscape. We then go back and measure the soil carbon again after a few years and calculate the difference to quantify the change that's happened. And the difference is not only the difference in the mean, but also based on the statistics we measure in both of those sampling grounds. We can influence those statistics by how we structure the sampling program, and that's a big emphasis on our work. Next slide, please. So you're not credited on all of the difference that we measure. There's a chance that if we repeated the sampling at different locations, we wouldn't get the same result. And in recognition of this, the methodology includes a discount that is applied to the measured difference based on the sampling statistics. Basically, the measured difference of the carbon stock between the two rounds is discounted to the value that we'd probably get if at least 6 out of 10 times if we repeated that sampling. So they use the statistics to sort of give a certain degree of confidence that those changes that we just measured are real. Now, internally, we term this discount minimum credible change, as it's the amount of change that has to happen before any credits can be issued. We've used the calculations on this discount as a way of monitoring how well we do in the sampling, because it's a relatively simple concept, which is just basically how much is taken off any measured change that we record in the field. So if you're running a project on your farm, you need to manage the project to make sure that the changes in soil carbon happen. And it's our job to measure that well so that we minimize the amount of discount that would occur from any changes you make through good sampling design and adequate numbers of samples. Okay, next slide, please. So practically, what does this mean? If we ignore the temporary discounts and a project achieved a change in soil carbon stock of only 1 tonne of soil carbon per hectare per annum, if you had a minimum credible change of 5 tonnes of carbon per hectare, you would receive no credits after 5 years, and the equivalent credits to a change of 5 tonnes after 10 years. However, if you had a minimum credible change in the project through our measurement of only 1 tonne of carbon per hectare, you'd receive the credits equivalent to 4 tonnes of carbon after 5 years and 9 tonnes after 10 years. So this makes a huge difference to the cash flow profile throughout a project, in that you start getting payments earlier, rather than having to accumulate as much carbon to overcome that discount because of the sampling performance. Next one, please. So if we look how we've done over the course of the 175 projects or carbon estimation areas that we've done in our commercial projects. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I thought there was another slide. So based on what we've looked at with those in those projects, 50% of our projects needed a change of less than 0.9 tonnes of carbon, and that's equivalent of 0.01% organic carbon for a change to be able to make a claim. So that's a very small change is needed in the landscape before we can achieve that measured change and achieve credits being issued. 95% of our projects only needed a change of 2.3 tonnes of carbon, or 0.03% change in soil organic carbon before credits could be issued. So that means that if you can improve the soil carbons by a very modest amount, you can get a return on the project more through being able to detect the difference and not be discounted based on the sampling performance. And that's the area that our research team spends most of our effort on trying to understand and try to reduce those few that have higher credible changes back to understand why they happen and bring those back to something that's much more acceptable, like under 1. There's obviously so much more to this, but probably need another webinar or maybe 10 to cover it. So I'll hand it back to Terry at this point.
Thanks, Rob. So just a quick summary of our original thesis that soil carbon projects are not about reducing productivity, but about increasing it. So we've got results at scale. So, 46,000 acres. Our accuracy across 95% of all projects down to 1 metre, 1.2 metres is a minimum credible change of 2.3 tonnes per hectare. That, as Rob pointed out, is very, very high accuracy. They're cost effective. So across those 4 projects, the annualised return from the carbon project itself on the smallest one is 25%, on the 3 bigger ones is 65% per annum return on investment. Now that's the investment in the baseline measurement, the second measurement, the audit cost, which was $40,000 for these guys, and the success fee that goes to CarbonLink. So they proved to be very profitable and up to 3 to 5 times more profitable than livestock production over the same period. And I think the critical thing to really take away is that carbon credits are created by management. Rainfall stimulates things, but management is what drives crediting. It's possible to increase livestock production as well, particularly with legumes in the system. And we're adding water holding capacity to our properties. So I'll move on. Thanks, Cassie. Video's not working again, so we'll probably just leave this.
So I guess one of the original reasons we got into the change in our grazing business was to increase carrying capacity, and we have seen that increase from around about 8 stock days to early 20s, 22 or 3 stock days per hectare. We're also seeing an increase in desirable species, and certainly we're in melon-hole country here, and small falls of rain used to run off, and now our water infiltration is much better. Our recovery out of dry periods It's much more rapid. We're seeing more humus in the soil, but we can certainly dig up and find evidence of glomalin on root systems and therefore bacterial activity. But I suppose it's more the structure of the soil looks to have improved a lot.
So just before we go into this slide, Terry, we've got another question on what would sequestration have been if the properties had not changed their practices?
I would suspect zero. Generally, our current grazing practices are not sequestering carbon. In fact, they're taking it out. So it could well have been going the other way. So if I take a couple of these properties that I've known for 20 or 30 years, they were burning annually. They were clearing all trees on a regular basis. They had poor ground cover most of the time, and overgrazing, weeds coming in, desirable plants going out. Definitely those properties, in my opinion, would have been going backwards.
I think too, what we observed in these properties was they went through at the beginning of the period between the sampling, there was some good, reasonable seasons, and then they went through a very hard time for the remainder of the project. And I think a big factor in their being able to claim credits was their management going into the drought and during the drought, that they preserved what they'd put in. So we don't have a number of measurements through that time, but looking at it, you go, well, the most likely scenario was that they got some good increases at the beginning and then didn't lose it. They managed the property well during that drought to not lose the carbon they gained at the beginning.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Rob. I think that it was the fact that they destocked by such an amount, and they're good managers, and they maintained their ground cover, and they were very, very conscious of trying to maintain the ground cover at the highest possible level they could. In some areas they couldn't because they had pasture dieback that killed everything. And I guess what demonstrates this is that 44% of the credits issued to these guys were issued from below 30 centimetres. And one of these properties, 69% of his credits came from below 30 centimetres. Now that's a property where there was black cracking clays, bare ground due to the pasture dieback, the drought, and those soils just opened up and lost carbon in the surface. But the amount of carbon stored below 30 centimetres was very, very significant. And that's what pulled them through.
Yeah, so even though that they had to destock or reduce their stocking numbers during those drier periods, they still managed to increase their carrying capacity overall during that time.
Yeah.
So
you go in.
Yeah, so thank you, Terry and Rob, for all of that wonderful information. We're going to wrap it up with just a couple of summary points on what we've seen tonight through the appropriate management and measurement. Soil carbon project can complement your existing system and potentially provide an additional co-benefit and income stream that will assist to prop up in those harder times, but also look at ways to risk mitigate farming operations during those seasonal constraint periods. And we want to see producers engage in the practice change to strengthen their system. We don't want producers to think about carbon credits as anything more than a bonus for doing the right thing, rather than changing their practice to get credits. So there's many more benefits than just ACCUs. Not that they're not a nice thing to get as a reward for all the hard work. It's clearly important to have sound understanding of the mechanics behind the project in order to strive for success, and this is something we would like to strongly encourage. We want to see producers be comfortable and confident with the implementation of practice change and the associated risks and opportunities through the measurement techniques to ensure that if you do decide to commit to a project, that the results are positive and that there is project flexibility and not one size will fit all. So, and also, as we've discussed, there is the funding consideration that we now offer to get people up on their feet initially. So, CarbonLink is service providers for soil carbon projects, and we've been in the industry since 2007 with proven results, capturing over 92% of the soil carbon credits issued to date. We're headed up by the leaders in the industry, including Robert, who you've heard from today, and obviously Terry, who is known as one of the great innovators of Australian agriculture. We strongly believe in technology and innovation behind our operations, and we want to partner with progressive and innovating producers to invest in your success. We are here to invest in you and your business, and we believe we can help you succeed. So just like the projects we've talked about today, if there's any more questions for this presentation for Rob and Terry while we've got them, otherwise more than happy if people email through some questions as well.
All right, if there's no more questions, we might call it a day. Thank you very much. Forget one, did we?
So what is the depth of soil carbon measurements?
We measure to 1.2 metres where we can get there, or to wherever we hit resistance. So if there's bedrock or heavy clay or anything shallower, that's we go as far as we can go, down to 1.2.
That might vary on how much we can report on because of the way that the methodology is structured. That if we the reporting is done on mass, on the soil mass, and it's determined by some of the 10% of the lightest cores that you take in a project. So while we go to 1.2 metres, there's quite a lot of science in the design of your carbon estimation areas to make sure that we can report on all of that 1.2 metres in the project. But that might be another subject for a different webinar.
Yep.
And it's probably also a point to make there that the minimum sampling depth with the method is 300 mil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like everyone's quiet on the question front.
Yep, must have answered all the questions. So thank you very much for your time. Thanks, Em, for leading us through that, and Rob for backing us up, and all your good work in there that nobody sees.
Very happy in my back room.
And as Em said, if you've got any questions after this, just email them through. We'd be happy to follow up with you.
All right.
That's great.
Thanks,
Thanks
guys.
everyone.
Thanks for coming, guys.